Jonathan Miller was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he arrived. Tonight, he had arrived in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, a place where the carpet was thick enough to swallow sound, and the air smelled faintly of money and lily of the valley. This was the annual fundraising gala for the prestigious Northwood Academy, the kind of private school where tuition cost more than a decent car, and the silent auctions featured week-long stays in Tuscany. Jonathan loved nights like this. It was validation. But does external validation really matter? If you've ever been in situations where you had to keep up appearances, hit that like button and stick around until the end, because Jonathan's fall is going to shock you. He stood 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in a custom charcoal suit, the kind that looked effortless but cost a small fortune. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his smile, wide and easy, was fixed on his face like a presidential portrait. He wasn't just a parent here, he was an institution. He was the guy who could always be counted on, the reliable provider, the titan of industry, or at least that's what he made absolutely sure everyone believed. Beside him was his daughter, Sophie Miller. Sophie was 16, beautiful, and possessing that kind of casual confidence only afforded to kids who had never once worried about the electric bill. She was wearing a dress that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, and she was slightly bored, which ironically only added to Jonathan's pride. Her boredom signaled normalcy. It signaled security. "Another glass of sparkling cider, Dad?" Sophie asked, fiddling with a pearl bracelet.
"Just water for me, sweetie," Jonathan replied, but his eyes were scanning the crowd. He was looking for affirmation. He was looking for Laura Chen, whose husband ran a rival real estate firm, and who always eyed Jonathan with a mixture of respect and envy. He was looking for Mr. Henderson, the headmaster, whose praise was the equivalent of a public knighthood in this exclusive social circle. A moment later, he got his wish. Headmaster Henderson, a man whose bow tie was always slightly crooked, but whose handshake was always firm, tapped the microphone. "And we absolutely must thank Jonathan Miller," Henderson boomed, his voice echoing slightly off the high ceiling. "Jonathan, your generosity last year helped us fund the entire new science wing. Truly a commitment to the future of our children." A ripple of polite applause washed over Jonathan. He gave a modest 2-second nod, enough to acknowledge the praise, but not so much as to seem thirsty for it. Sophie offered him a small, genuine smile. That smile was everything. It told him, "You are the winner, Dad." And that was the core of Jonathan's whole operation. For months, maybe even a year now, the foundation of his wealth had been crumbling like dry dirt. His primary investments had turned sour. A massive commercial property deal had collapsed dramatically, taking with it a significant chunk of his liquid assets. The worst part? He hadn't told a soul. Not his wife, not his accountant, and certainly not the people in this room. He couldn't tell them. His entire identity, his social standing, his access to deals, his family's peace of mind was wrapped up in the image of permanent, unshakable success. If he admitted vulnerability, he'd lose everything that mattered, including the silent admiration of his peers. He had been pretending everything was fine, leaning into the performance with the desperation of a man clinging to a cliff face. He needed tonight to be perfect.
As the program wound down, Jonathan spotted the reception desk near the entrance. They were taking final pledges for a scholarship fund. This was his chance to reinforce the narrative, not just with past deeds, but with current, casual generosity. "Let's go make one last contribution, Soph," Jonathan said, tucking his hand into the small of her back and guiding her toward the desk. "A little something extra for the arts program. They always need it." Sophie walked with him easily. She was used to these displays. They were part of the Miller ritual. As they approached, a few other parents were milling about. Laura Chen was there, sipping a glass of wine, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation about summer homes, but clearly listening. And then there was Ethan Price. Ethan Price was a facilities contractor. He wasn't a parent, but he was here because he needed to be. He was a quiet, practical man in a simple blue blazer, waiting patiently near the desk for the school treasurer to sign off on an overdue reimbursement for HVAC work he'd completed back in October. Jonathan wouldn't have given Ethan the time of day normally. Ethan was utility, not status. But tonight, Ethan was perfectly positioned. Jonathan reached the desk. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah with nervous eyes, smiled politely. "Mr. Miller, wonderful to see you," Sarah said. "Are you closing out your silent auction bids?" No, something better," Jonathan said, projecting his voice just enough so that Laura Chen and the cluster of parents nearby could hear. He gave Sophie a wink. "I was just so moved by the scholarship presentation. I want to add an additional spontaneous pledge. Let's make it $5,000 right now for the scholarship fund, straight up." It was the perfect amount, significant enough to impress, casual enough to imply it was pocket change.
He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out his sleek black leather wallet. He extracted a platinum card, the one with the highest limit, the one that usually signaled automatic approval anywhere in the world. He handed it to Sarah, the clerk, with the air of a man paying for a cup of coffee. "Just run that, please," Jonathan instructed, maintaining his easy smile, already planning the route back to the bar to accept the inevitable congratulations. Sarah took the card, her fingers slightly clumsy, and slid it into the hotel's portable terminal. The room, though still full of music and conversation, seemed to hold its breath around the desk. Or perhaps that was just Jonathan's internal reality warping the moment. The terminal paused. It paused for too long. Jonathan's smile tightened by a millimeter. Slow hotel Wi-Fi, he thought instantly. It's always the Wi-Fi. Then the machine beeped, a soft, discreet sound that nonetheless felt like a klaxon alarm in the silent corners of Jonathan's mind. Sarah's nervous eyes widened slightly as she looked down at the screen. The message was clear, stark, and utterly humiliating. Transaction declined. And right beneath it, in smaller but still visible text, was a sub-message, low available balance. The color drained instantly from Jonathan's face, replaced by a sudden, cold flush of heat. It was like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over his head. He saw the message, but he registered it first through Sarah's face. She lifted her eyes to him, a look of profound, uncomfortable apology replacing her polite smile. I apologize, Mr. Miller," she stammered, holding the card out.
Jonathan reached for the card, his fingers feeling numb. "No, impossible. That card has a 6-figure limit. It's a glitch. The bank must have flagged a large purchase earlier today. A security measure, that's all." He forced his smile back, pushing the panic down into a dark, locked box inside his chest. "Ah, darn it," he chuckled, the sound brittle and unnatural. "Must be a security hold. My bank is always doing this when I travel. Silly technology." He pulled out a second card from the same wallet, a gold-plated executive card, his backup. He handed it over, confident this one would work. He had to be confident. Sophie was standing right there. "Try this one, please, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping slightly, trying to control the volume of the moment. He glanced quickly at Laura Chen, who had definitely paused her conversation and was now watching them with an expressionless, observant gaze. Ethan Price, the contractor, was standing only 3 feet away, pretending to examine a flower arrangement. But Ethan Price wasn't looking at the flowers. He was looking at the bank logo on the card Jonathan had just retrieved. He recognized that logo. It was the same bank that had been sending Jonathan's office overdue notices for the last 4 months, notices for the massive maintenance contracts that Jonathan's company had failed to pay. Sarah, the clerk, ran the second card. The terminal paused again. This time, the silence felt heavier, longer. Beep. Transaction declined. Sarah looked utterly mortified. She didn't even need to look at the sub-message this time. The result was final. She quickly slid the second card back across the desk. "Mr. Miller, I am so sorry," she whispered, her cheeks turning pink. "Both are declining." The air around Jonathan seemed to thicken. The room, which had been warm and inviting, suddenly felt cold and exposed.
Sophie looked up at her father. Her expression was not one of shame or anger, but a deep, unsettling confusion. She had never, in her entire life, seen her father fail at something so simple, so fundamental. Money was supposed to be the one thing he controlled absolutely.
Jonathan felt the blood pounding in his ears. The mask he had been wearing for months, the one of effortless success, was slipping, and the naked panic underneath was threatening to burst out. He reached for the cards, grabbing them a little too quickly. "Right, well, this is absolutely ridiculous," he said, forcing a low, conspiratorial tone as if the bank was trying to sabotage him specifically. "Look, Sarah, I'll just call my private banker in the morning. Clearly there's some kind of widespread system error." He tapped the wallet, trying to make the gesture look casual, like he had a dozen other functional cards he just couldn't be bothered to use right now. Sarah, however, was trained to handle awkward situations. She knew how to manage a public scene. "Of course, Mr. Miller, I understand," she said, but her tone was firm and professional. She leaned in slightly. "In the meantime, perhaps you could step just to the side. We have a few other parents waiting to finalize their pledges." It was the polite way of saying, "You are causing a scene and you need to move." Jonathan Miller, the man who had just been publicly thanked for funding the entire science wing, was being asked to step aside because his credit card was declined. He felt the eyes of the room on him, even though most people were still talking. The conversations hadn't stopped, but they had subtly shifted. The focus, the center of gravity in the ballroom, had moved away from him. The applause for the previous speaker, the one who had pledged to sponsor the junior soccer team, resumed with enthusiasm elsewhere in the room. Jonathan was no longer acknowledged. He was simply a momentary obstruction.
Laura Chen finally broke her silence, not by speaking to Jonathan, but by turning smoothly back to her companion and continuing her conversation about Tuscany, her voice just loud enough to signal that the brief, embarrassing interlude was over. Ethan Price, the contractor, finally got his turn at the desk. He didn't look at Jonathan. He just offered a brief nod of recognition, a nod that said, "I know what I just saw, and I know why." Jonathan felt a profound physical sense of cold. He stuffed the cards back into his wallet, his movements jerky and hurried. "Right, well," he muttered, trying to look like he was merely relocating for a better view of the dessert table. "Come on, self." He started to walk away from the desk, trying desperately to maintain the illusion of control, of purpose. He kept his shoulders back and his chin high, but inside, a massive, silent alarm was screaming. He realized he was walking alone. He glanced behind him. Sophie was taking her time. She was walking a step ahead of him now, not trailing loyally behind, but creating a small, noticeable gap between them. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the ground, then toward the exit. It wasn't just the $5,000 he'd lost. It was the public failure. It was the crack in the foundation that everyone had just seen. And worst of all, Sophie had seen it. His reliable image, the symbol of his permanent success, had just been rejected by a cheap plastic machine. They made their way silently toward the coat check. Jonathan tried to think of something reassuring to say, something to smooth over the moment, but the words got in his throat. "Dad?" Sophie finally asked, her voice low. "Yes, sweetie," Jonathan managed, his tone still trying to sound nonchalant. "Is everything okay with the bank?" she asked. She wasn't asking about the $5,000. She was asking about the fact of the decline.
Jonathan forced his practiced, confident smile, the one that had fooled hundreds of people over the years. "Of course, Soph. Just a minor glitch. You know how those big banks are. Happens all the time. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." He watched her face closely, waiting for the reassurance, the acceptance of his explanation. But Sophie didn't smile back. She just nodded slowly, a small, thoughtful gesture that somehow felt more damning than any accusation. She knew, or at least she suspected, that this wasn't just a simple glitch. They retrieved their coats. The warmth of the ballroom seemed to dissipate as soon as they stepped out into the hotel lobby. "Let's just get the car," Jonathan said, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the Harrington. As they waited near the valet stand,
Jonathan pulled out his phone. He needed to call his CFO, Greg. He needed a story, a plausible explanation for the immediate cash flow problem, and he needed it yesterday. He typed out a text to Greg. Emergency. Need to talk. Bank situation is critical. Call me 6 a.m. sharp. He didn't hit send. He couldn't risk Greg seeing that in the middle of the night. He deleted the text and opted for a simpler, less frantic message. Greg, need urgent meeting 7 a.m. Priority 1. Confirmed. He hit send and immediately felt a wave of nausea. He was finally admitting, even if only to Greg, that the house of cards was shaking. The black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the curb. It was a beautiful car, expensive, and it was leased. Jonathan opened the passenger door for Sophie, and she slid in. As he got behind the wheel, the reality of the evening settled like a heavy stone. He had come here to reaffirm his status, and instead, he had been publicly humiliated in front of his greatest admirers and his daughter.
He drove out of the hotel parking lot, heading toward their sprawling home in the affluent suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut. The drive was usually a relaxing transition, a moment to bask in the satisfaction of his success. Tonight, the silence in the car was deafening. Jonathan finally broke the silence, trying to steer the conversation back to normalcy. So, that geometry test, Soph? How did you feel about that? Sophie was looking out the window, watching the glittering lights of the city recede. It was fine, Dad, she replied, her voice flat. But, Dad, about the pledge? We'll sort it out tomorrow, sweetheart. It's a minor administrative detail, Jonathan insisted, gripping the steering wheel tighter. No, not the money, Sophie said, turning to look at him. You said you had to call your private banker. Don't you have an assistant who handles that stuff? This was the dangerous question. The question that showed she was paying attention, that she was evaluating the cracks in his narrative. In the past, Jonathan had always delegated such trivialities. The fact that he was personally worrying about a declined card suggested a level of involvement that contradicted his image as a high-level executive detached from the minutiae of banking. I prefer to handle my charitable donations personally, Soph, he lied smoothly, feeling the sweat prickling his neck. It's about accountability. Sophie didn't challenge him, but the silence returned, heavier than before. Jonathan drove faster. He had to get home. He needed to retreat to his study, pour a stiff drink, and face the spreadsheets he had been avoiding for weeks. The truth was, the minor glitch was an existential threat. The reason the cards were declining was simple. He had been liquidating assets and shuffling money around to cover massive, unexpected business debts, and he had miscalculated his available cash flow. The bank wasn't holding his funds. The funds simply weren't there anymore. The low balance warning was real. He had been so focused on maintaining the facade, the beautiful house, the expensive car, the generous public donations, that he had bled his operational accounts dry. He was functionally broke, yet he was living the life of a multimillionaire, sustained only by debt and the belief that the next big deal was always just around the corner. But the next big deal hadn't materialized, and now the walls were closing in, starting with a $5,000 decline in front of Laura Chen and his own daughter. They pulled up to the Miller residence, a sprawling Tudor mansion set back from the street behind perfectly manicured hedges. It was a testament to his supposed success. As they walked up the flagstone path, Jonathan tried to regain his composure. He needed to be the strong patriarch tonight. It was a good evening, Soph, he said, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't feel. You looked lovely. Thanks, Dad, she replied softly. The front door opened into a majestic foyer with a sweeping staircase. Jonathan's wife, Carol, appeared from the living room, looking tired but elegant in her silk pajamas. You're home late, darling, Carol said, walking over and kissing Jonathan lightly on the cheek. How was the fundraiser? Did you see anyone interesting?
Jonathan felt a momentary flicker of relief. Carol hadn't been there. She hadn't witnessed the humiliation. He could still control the narrative here. It was fine, honey. Very successful for the school. Lots of money raised, he said, pulling off his coat. I pledged a little extra for the arts program, actually.
He didn't specify that the pledge hadn't gone through. He let the implication hang in the air. Jonathan Miller is a generous man. Jonathan Miller is successful. That's wonderful, dear. You're such a committed philanthropist, Carol said, her voice warm with approval. Sophie, who was heading up the stairs, paused on the third step and looked back down at her parents. Jonathan caught her eye. He saw the confusion still lingering there, mixed now with a hint of something else, a critical assessment. She had heard his lie of omission, the way he had carefully avoided mentioning the declined cards. She didn't say anything. She just turned and continued up the stairs to her room, leaving Jonathan and Carol standing in the foyer, bathed in the soft glow of the chandelier. Jonathan felt a sudden, desperate urge to go after Sophie, to tell her the absolute truth, to beg for her understanding. But he couldn't. If the truth got out, he'd lose the trust he valued most. I need to head to the study for a bit, Carol, Jonathan said, running a hand over his tired face. Just a few calls to make before I turn in. All right, dear. Don't stay up too late. He walked past the large, ornate living room, past the dining room where they rarely ate, and into his private study. It was a dark, oak-paneled room, designed to look like the office of a man who managed empires. He closed the heavy door, shutting out the rest of the house, and finally allowed the mask to drop. He leaned against the door, breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked over to the mahogany bar, poured 3 fingers of high-end bourbon, and downed it in 2 quick burning gulps. Then he walked to his massive desk, switched on the lamp, and pulled out his laptop. He opened the terrifying spreadsheet, the one labeled Project Phoenix, which was actually just a detailed log of his mounting debts and dwindling assets.
The balance sheet was a disaster. He was operating on fumes. The small, spontaneous pledge of $5,000 at the fundraiser would have overdrawn his primary business account into the red, a fact he had missed in his frantic attempts to juggle funds. His primary problem wasn't just the money. It was the facilities contractor, Ethan Price. Jonathan rubbed his temples. Ethan Price's firm was owed nearly $50,000 by Jonathan's company, Miller Holdings, for months of unpaid maintenance work on a commercial complex that was now largely vacant. Ethan had seen the bank logo on the declined card. He had been waiting for reimbursement. If Ethan Price started talking, if he started telling people that Jonathan Miller, the great philanthropist, was bouncing checks and stiffing small contractors, the entire carefully constructed image would collapse. Jonathan had insisted everything was fine, not just to the outside world, but to himself. He genuinely believed that if he maintained the performance, the reality would eventually catch up. He thought he could bluff his way through the crisis. He couldn't. He grabbed his phone again and dialed Greg, his CFO, even though it was nearly midnight. Greg was a nervous, efficient man who had been trying for months to get Jonathan to face the music. The phone rang 4 times before Greg answered, his voice thick with sleep and annoyance. Jonathan, do you know what time it is? Greg, listen to me. I need you to confirm every single available dollar we have in liquid assets right now. Every account, personal, business, the lot. I need the hard number by 7 a.m. No rounding, no estimates, the exact number. Greg sighed, a long, suffering sound over the line. Jonathan, we went over this last week. We are critically low. You pulled everything out of the operating account to cover the interest payment on the shoreline development loan. We are running on payroll scraps.
Just get me the number, Greg, Jonathan snapped, his voice tight. And I need you to find out immediately why my personal platinum card was declined tonight. They said low available balance.
That's impossible. Jonathan, the bank automatically lowers the limit if they see massive, unusual transfers out of your linked business accounts. They're protecting themselves. They smell trouble. A cold wave of dread washed over Jonathan. The bank didn't believe in him anymore. And Gred, Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. We have a problem with Ethan Price, the contractor. He was at the Northwood event tonight. He saw the decline, a beat of silence on the line. Then Greg's voice was suddenly wide awake, laced with genuine fear. He saw what? Jonathan, that's disastrous. He knows we owe him. If he starts demanding payment publicly, the banks will freeze us. We need to pay him immediately. We need to prioritize Price. I know, Jonathan said, pacing the length of his study carpet. But where is the money coming from, Greg? We don't have $50,000 lying around to pay one angry contractor. We have to find it, Jonathan, or we have to sell something. Right now, your reputation is the only thing keeping us solvent. If Price sinks that, we are done. Jonathan ended the call abruptly, his mind racing. He had to conjure $50,000 out of thin air before sunrise. He looked around his opulent study. Everything in it was a symbol of his success, but none of it was liquid. He walked over to the large window, pulling back the velvet curtains. Outside, the Greenwich night was still and cold. He could see the faint light filtering from Sophie's window upstairs. He had insisted everything was fine. He had demanded admiration and reassurance. And tonight, a small, discreet machine had called his bluff, exposing the terrifying truth, not just to the world, but to the one person whose opinion he truly feared.
Jonathan Miller, the millionaire, was standing in his gilded cage, utterly ruined. And the one person who knew it, his daughter, was now waiting to see what he would do next. The performance was over. The real crisis had just begun. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. Selling assets would take weeks. He needed a cash infusion by morning. He needed a miracle. He sat down heavily at his desk, pulling the bourbon bottle closer. He opened the file labeled Emergency Contacts, scrolling down until he found the name of a man he truly hoped he would never have to call. A man who dealt in high-risk, high-interest short-term loans. A man named Victor. This was no longer about maintaining an image. This was about survival. And it was about silencing Ethan Price before the contractor could speak the truth that would destroy Jonathan Miller completely. Jonathan Miller stared at the contact name on his screen. Victor the Fixer Moretti. It wasn't a contact he had saved with any pride. Victor didn't deal in mergers and acquisitions. He dealt in panic and collateral. Calling Victor was admitting that the conventional world of banking and legitimate finance had closed its doors. Jonathan took another burning swallow of the bourbon. The glass felt cold and heavy in his hand. He was trading his future peace for immediate silence. He hit the call button. It rang only once before a deep, gravelly voice answered. This decision is about to change everything. If you want to see more stories about the dark side of wealth and reputation, tap that subscribe button right now. Miller, Victor said. No greeting, no politeness. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly why you were calling at midnight. Victor, I apologize for the hour, Jonathan began, trying to inject some of his usual corporate authority into his tone. It sounded thin even to his own ears. Time is money, Jonathan. You know the rules. You need cash, and you need it fast. How much, and how fast? Jonathan didn't mince words. $50,000. I need it wired by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Non-negotiable deadline. Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle. $90,000 to silence a noisy contractor, is it? You're slipping, Miller. You usually handle this kind of mess before it hits the fan. Jonathan bristled. He hated that Victor knew the details, or at least guessed them accurately. The funds are for operational expenses. I'm simply liquidating some assets and the process is slow. This is a bridge loan. Bridge to where, Jonathan? The river of no return?
Victor paused, allowing the silence to hang heavy. My standard terms are 40% interest for anything under 72 hours, and I need ironclad collateral, something I can liquidate easily if you miss the deadline. 40%. On $50,000, that meant he'd owe $70,000 in less than 3 days. It was highway robbery, but Jonathan had no leverage. His entire reputation was hanging by the thread of Ethan Price's discretion. Agreed. 40%, Jonathan said, the words tasting like ash. As collateral, I'll offer the deed to the vacation condo in Aspen. It's free and clear, valued at $2 million. Victor whistled softly. A $2 million property for $50,000? You are truly desperate, Jonathan. All right. Send the paperwork to my encrypted portal immediately. The funds will hit your holding account precisely at 8:45 a.m., not a minute sooner. And don't be late on repayment. I don't send invoices, Jonathan. I send people. The call ended. Jonathan sat back in his chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him cold and shaking. He had secured the money, but he had just traded a piece of his family's tangible assets, a place where they had celebrated countless holidays, for a desperate 3-day reprieve. He had put the Aspen condo on the line to cover a $5,000 mistake and a $50,000 debt. The irony was suffocating. He spent the next 2 hours dealing with the encrypted portal, signing away the rights to the condo with a sinking heart. When he finally shut the laptop, the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the study window. He looked like hell. His suit was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and the fear was etched deep around his eyes. He had to fix that. He had to be Jonathan Miller, the unflappable titan, by the time Carol and Sophie woke up. He showered quickly, shaved meticulously, and put on a fresh, perfectly pressed light gray suit. He practiced his smile in the mirror, wide, easy, reassuring. Downstairs, the house smelled of fresh coffee and prosperity. Carol was already in the kitchen, reading financial news on her tablet. "Morning, dear," she said brightly, not looking up. "Did you get those calls sorted out?" "All sorted, honey," Jonathan said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He kept his voice light. "Just a minor administrative hiccup with the bank. Something about needing to confirm a security transfer after hours. All fixed now." Carol nodded vaguely. She trusted Jonathan implicitly when it came to money. His success was her security. She never questioned the mechanisms behind it. Then Sophie walked in. She was wearing her Northwood uniform, crisp and perfect, but her face held a gravity that belied her 16 years. She didn't look at the news. She looked straight at Jonathan. "Morning, Dad," she said, her tone polite but reserved. "Good morning, Soph. Ready for school?" "Sure." She sat down, picking at a piece of toast. The atmosphere around her felt charged, like a quiet room before a storm. Jonathan knew he had to address the elephant in the room, the declined card, before she brought it up again. "Listen, Soph, about last night," he began, leaning in conspiratorially, adopting the tone of a wise, protective father sharing a secret. "It was actually a good thing, in a way."
Sophie raised an eyebrow, a clear signal that she was skeptical. "The bank is moving all my charitable funds into a new, higher-yield account in Geneva," Jonathan explained, smoothly blending elements of truth, banks, transfers, with a complete fabrication. "It's a massive transfer, and sometimes when they move that much money, they temporarily freeze the associated cards as a security measure. It's a pain, but it protects our assets, right? It was just bad timing at the fundraiser." He offered his most confident, patronizing smile. "So, nothing to worry about, just the boring details of managing a large portfolio." He waited for the relief, the smile, the nod of acceptance. Sophie chewed slowly, looking him directly in the eye. "But Dad," she said quietly, "why did the clerk's screen say low available balance?" Jonathan felt a cold jolt run down his spine. He hadn't accounted for the detail. He had assumed Sophie, caught in the public embarrassment, hadn't read the fine print. He didn't miss a beat, though. The effort cost him. "Ah, good observation, Soph. That's exactly the problem with these automated systems," he said, shaking his head dismissively. "When the bank freezes the funds, the system reads it as zero available balance,
even though the money is actually there, just locked up. It's a terrible user interface. I'm going to call my banker later and complain about it." He watched her face. This time, the explanation was complex enough, technical enough, and delivered with enough conviction that it seemed to satisfy her logical mind, if not her gut. She nodded slowly again, that same thoughtful, assessing gesture from the night before. "Okay, Dad, that makes sense." But her eyes still held a lingering doubt. Jonathan knew that the seed of suspicion had been planted. He had successfully plastered over the crack, but the foundation underneath was still crumbling. He looked at his watch. 6:45 a.m. Time to leave for the emergency meeting with Greg.
"I have to run. Big meeting this morning," Jonathan announced, grabbing his briefcase. "Have a great day, Soph. Love you." "Love you too, Dad." He walked out, the weight of the lie pressing down on him. Jonathan met Greg, his CFO, not at the Miller Holdings skyscraper office, but at a discreet, windowless conference room in a short-term business center near the highway interchange. Secrecy was paramount. Greg looked worse than Jonathan felt. He was pale, his tie was loose, and he was clutching a massive binder of financial statements. "The transfer from Victor is confirmed, Jonathan," Greg said, his voice low and strained. "50,000 is in the holding account, but you need to understand, this is a $20,000 mistake. We're paying 40% interest for 3 days of cash flow. This is unsustainable." "I know the cost, Greg, but the cost of Ethan Price talking is the collapse of Miller Holdings," Jonathan countered, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "We have to neutralize him. He saw the bank logo, he knows we owe him, and he saw the decline. He's the walking, talking fuse to our powder cake." Greg nodded grimly. "I've arranged the meeting. Price is meeting you at the Coffee Corner Diner on Route 1, 20 minutes from here at 9:30 a.m. He insisted on a public place, probably for safety, but it's discreet enough." "Good. Have the cashier's check for 50,000 ready for me to sign. And Greg, listen, I need you to understand my strategy with Price. This isn't just about paying the debt. This is about buying his silence and his loyalty." "How do you propose to buy loyalty from a man you've stiffed for 4 months?" Greg asked skeptically.
"I'm going to offer him the future," Jonathan said, straightening his suit jacket. "We pay the debt in full, and then I offer him an exclusive long-term maintenance contract on our entire portfolio, a massive multi-year deal that guarantees him millions. I'll make him a fortune. He won't bite the hand that feeds him if the hand is offering a 5-course meal." Greg rubbed his temples. "That's incredibly risky, Jonathan. We can't guarantee future contracts if we don't have future cash flow." "We pretend we do, Greg. We maintain the illusion of success," Jonathan said, his voice hardening. "That is the only currency we have left. Ethan Price needs to believe that Miller Holdings is too big to fail and that he is now personally tied to our success. He needs to walk away believing he just got the deal of his life, not just a desperate reimbursement check." Greg reluctantly handed over the checkbook. "Just don't promise anything we absolutely cannot deliver, Jonathan. We are one missed payment away from the bank seizing everything." Jonathan signed the cashier's check for $50,000. It felt physically sickening to hand over the money he had borrowed at such an exorbitant rate, but it was necessary triage. "Wish me luck, Greg," Jonathan said, grabbing the check in his briefcase. "Just get the job done, Jonathan, and don't let him see you sweat." The coffee corner was exactly the kind of place Jonathan Miller avoided. It was busy, noisy, and smelled strongly of burnt coffee and bacon grease. It was a world away from the gilded silence of the Harrington Hotel ballroom. Ethan Price was already there, sitting in a booth in the back corner, looking unremarkable in his blue blazer and reading a local newspaper. He wasn't nervous. He looked patient. That patience was far more intimidating than any show of anger. Jonathan walked over, projecting the easy confidence of a man who was merely stopping by to settle a minor account discrepancy. "Ethan, thanks for meeting me on such short notice," Jonathan said, sliding into the vinyl booth opposite him. Ethan folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside him. He didn't offer a handshake. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate you finding the time," Ethan replied, his tone flat and professional. He wasn't deferential, which immediately put Jonathan on edge. "Look, Ethan, I wanted to apologize personally for the delay in payment. It's entirely unacceptable. We had an administrative snafu,
A new accounting system rollout that caused some serious disruptions in vendor payments. Completely my fault for not overseeing it properly. Jonathan reached into his briefcase and pulled out the crisp, official check. He slid it across the table. Here is the full payment, $50,000 plus 10% interest for the inconvenience. That's $55,000. I want to make sure you know we value your partnership. Ethan picked up the check, examined the amount, and then looked at the signature. He folded it slowly and tucked it into his inner jacket pocket. Thank you, Mr. Miller. That's a relief. Payroll was getting tight. He met Jonathan's gaze, his eyes sharp and steady. But let's be honest, sir. That check isn't 10% interest for inconvenience. That's hush money. Jonathan felt the blood rush to his face, but he maintained his composure. He chuckled, a smooth practice sound. Hush money. Ethan, I don't know what you mean. This is simply a late payment settlement. No, sir. This is you trying to keep me quiet after I saw you fail to pay a $5,000 pledge at Northwood last night, Ethan said, his voice calm, never rising above a conversational level. I'm a facilities contractor. I see bank statements and invoices all the time. I recognize that bank logo, Mr. Miller, and I know the difference between a system error and a cash flow problem.
Ethan leaned forward slightly. You owe me $50,000, and you're bouncing checks for $5,000. That tells me Miller Holdings is in serious trouble, and you've been using my company to keep the lights on elsewhere. And that tells me that if I start telling the other vendors what I saw, you're going to be facing a major crisis by lunchtime. Jonathan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Ethan Price was smarter and tougher than he had anticipated. This is the moment where everything could collapse. If you're enjoying this story, share it with someone who needs to understand the dangers of living beyond your means. He wasn't just a contractor, he was a shrewd businessman who understood leverage perfectly. Jonathan dropped the pretense of the administrative error. He shifted gears, moving to the exclusive contract offer. All right, Ethan, you're a smart man. And you're right, there are short-term liquidity issues, but they are short-term, Jonathan emphasized. Miller Holdings is fundamentally sound. We're simply restructuring some debt. But you have shown me two things: your loyalty in not running your mouth last night, and your intelligence in recognizing the opportunity this presents. Jonathan spread his hands on the table. I'm not offering you a settlement, Ethan. I'm offering you a partnership. I want to make you a wealthy man. We are about to acquire 3 new commercial properties in Stamford. I want you and your firm to handle all the maintenance for the entire portfolio. Exclusive 5-year contract. We're talking about millions of dollars in guaranteed revenue for your company. Ethan listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Jonathan finished, Ethan slowly shook his head.
Mr. Miller, I appreciate the offer, but what good is a 5-year contract if the company offering it collapses in 5 weeks? You just paid me with money you clearly didn't have, money that probably came from a source with very short repayment terms. I can't risk the future of my business on a handshake and a promise from a man whose platinum card got declined last night. Jonathan felt a wave of despair. The illusion was failing. Ethan was demanding something more concrete, something that guaranteed his own stability, regardless of Miller Holdings' fate. What do you want, Ethan? Jonathan asked, his voice low and tight, finally dropping all facade of authority. Ethan leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. I want 2 things. First, the $55,000 is non-refundable, obviously. Second, I want the 5-year contract, yes, but I want the first year's management fee, $150,000, paid up front, within 24 hours, as a retainer. That protects me if Miller Holdings goes sideways in the next 6 months. It shows me you are serious about this relationship, and it shows me you have access to real cash, not just 3-day loans. $150,000, on top of the $55,000 he had just paid. Jonathan didn't have that kind of money. He had just exhausted his immediate borrowing capacity with Victor. Ethan, that's an astronomical retainer. No one pays a year's fee up front. You do, Mr. Miller, Ethan countered simply, or I go public with what I saw last night. I start calling the other vendors, and then I call the Northwood Academy board and ask why their chief benefactor is stiffing small businesses. Your reputation will be shredded, and the banks will pull the plug. You won't just lose Miller Holdings, you'll lose the house, the car, and the respect of your daughter. The mention of Sophie hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Ethan knew exactly where to strike. Jonathan looked away, out the diner window at the traffic passing by on Route 1. He was trapped. He was being extorted. But he knew Ethan was right. His reputation was the only asset left. $150,000.
Jonathan repeated, feeling the weight of the demand. In certified funds by 9:30 a.m. tomorrow, Ethan confirmed. And I want the contract signed today. The terms must include a specific clause that any breach of this retainer agreement results in immediate public disclosure of all outstanding debts from 2023. Ethan wasn't just asking for money. He was demanding a written, legally binding guarantee that would destroy Jonathan if he failed. Jonathan swallowed his pride, the bitterness sharp in his throat. Done, he said, forcing the word out. Greg will deliver the contract and the funds tomorrow morning. Ethan finally offered a small, professional smile, a victor's smile. I knew we could work this out, Mr. Miller. Congratulations on the new partnership. I look forward to a long and prosperous relationship. They shook hands. Ethan's grip was firm and dry. Jonathan's hand felt clammy. Jonathan left the diner feeling utterly hollowed out. He had bought silence, but at a catastrophic price. He had 24 hours to find another $150,000. He was sinking deeper into the quicksand. Jonathan drove straight to the Miller Holdings offices, the place he had avoided rather. He needed the infrastructure, the security of his own domain to tackle this new massive problem. Greg was waiting for him, pacing anxiously. How did it go? Greg asked immediately, seeing the grim look on Jonathan's face. Jonathan sank into his leather office chair. It went exactly as badly as it could have. He took the $55,000, and then he demanded a $150,000 retainer, paid upfront by tomorrow morning, plus a contract with a nuclear clause that guarantees our destruction if we miss a single future payment.
Greg stared, aghast. $150,000? Jonathan, that's impossible. Victor won't lend us that much again, not on the same collateral, not this fast, and not without even higher interest. Then we find another Victor, Greg. We find someone else, or we sell something that moves instantly, Jonathan insisted, running his fingers through his hair. What assets can we liquidate today? What cash is sitting in any obscure account? They spent the next 3 hours tearing apart the balance sheets, looking for hidden reserves, but there were none. Jonathan had been too effective at shuffling money to cover past mistakes. The reserves were gone. The only thing liquid enough to move that fast, Jonathan, is your private collection, Greg finally said, pointing to a line item on the spreadsheet. The art, the sports memorabilia, specifically the vintage baseball cards you keep in the safe deposit box. Jonathan felt a cold resistance. His collection was his passion, his quiet hobby, and a symbol of his truly disposable wealth. He had an original Honus Wagner tobacco card, a rarity worth a fortune, and a collection of signed Babe Ruth items. They were priceless, not just monetarily, but emotionally. No, absolutely not. That collection is non-negotiable, Jonathan snapped. Jonathan, the Wagner card alone is worth well over $500,000 on the private market. We can get a collateralized loan against it instantly. We can get the $150,000 we need, plus cover Victor's loan repayment if we use the collection. It's not for sale. It's not for sale, but the rest of your life is, Jonathan, Greg said, leaning over the desk, his voice tight with urgency. You need to decide right now what you value more, a piece of cardboard or your daughter's college fund. Because if Ethan Price talks, you lose everything. Jonathan looked at the ceiling, fighting back a wave of crushing defeat. He was being forced to dismantle his life, piece by piece, just to maintain the facade of stability. Fine, Jonathan whispered, defeated. Call the broker. Tell him I need an urgent, private valuation and a loan against the collection. Today. Now. Greg immediately started making calls, his voice hushed and professional, arranging the emergency liquidation. That evening, Jonathan arrived home late. The weight of the day, the extortion, the humiliation, the forced sale of his beloved collection made him feel ancient. He found Sophie in the kitchen, studying for a history test. Carol was upstairs, working on a charity gala invitation list. Jonathan poured a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. Long day, Dad? Sophie asked, not looking up from her textbook. Extremely long, Soph. But I signed a massive new contract today.
It means big things for Miller Holdings. Very exciting. He was still performing, even though he was exhausted. Sophie finally looked up, her pen hovering over the page. Dad, can I ask you something personal? Of course, sweetie. Anything. That baseball card collection, the one you keep in the bank's safe deposit box? The Honest Wagner card? Jonathan froze. How did she know about the urgent sale? Had Greg been indiscreet? Yes, Soph. What about it? Mrs. Henderson, Headmaster Henderson's wife. She was talking to Mom today about the fundraiser. She mentioned that you were very excited about the art auction this year, but you passed on bidding on the signed Yankees bat. Sophie lowered her voice. She said you told her last year that you would never sell the Wagner card because it was your anger.
Jonathan felt a cold dread spread through him. This wasn't about the decline anymore. This was about the narrative he had built around his life. Yes, well, it's a big collection, Soph. I move things around. Sometimes I sell an item to acquire a better one. It's investment management, he explained, trying to sound bored by the topic. But are you selling it, Dad? Sophie pressed, her eyes searching his. Because if you're selling your anchor and your cards were declined and you had to personally handle the bank issue, maybe things aren't just a minor glitch, are they? He looked straight into her eyes, pleading for her understanding. I'm doing this, Soph, so that your life, your school, and your future are completely secure. I am taking the hit now, so you never have to worry. I need you to trust me on this. He offered a weary, genuine smile, stripped of the usual swagger. Sophie studied him for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion, the stress he usually hid so well. This partial admission, this confession of turbulence, was more honest than anything he had told her in months. So we're not poor, Dad? She asked, the question simple and cutting. No, sweetheart, we are absolutely not poor. We are just temporarily under pressure, he assured her, the lie still necessary to keep the whole structure from falling. I will fix this. I always do. But I need you to keep this between us. This kind of information, if it gets out, can hurt the business. Can you do that for me? Sophie looked down at her history book. I can keep a secret, Dad. Thank you, Soph. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder. A huge weight lifted from his chest. He had bought her silence too. For now. But as he walked away, he knew the truth. He wasn't securing her future. He was dismantling it, piece by agonizing piece, just to buy a few more hours of pretending. He had until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow to find another $150,000, or the whole performance would end in public ruin. He headed to his study, the urgent calls to the art broker already scheduled. Tonight, he would trade his most cherished possessions
for the right to continue his desperate charade. The price of maintaining the image of success was turning out to be far higher than the cost of failure. Jonathan Miller spent the rest of the night, until the sun was fully up, on the phone with Greg and the art broker. The process was sickeningly fast. When you are rich, the system works efficiently, even when you are liquidating priceless heirlooms to cover basic contractor debt.
The Honus Wagner card, the centerpiece of his collection, the small, fragile piece of cardboard that represented the foundation of his first real, independent success, was now collateral. It was sitting in a secure vault, ready to be sold to a private collector if Jonathan missed the payment deadline for the $150,000 he needed to borrow immediately. He had traded his past success for his present illusion. By 9 a.m., the funds were wired to Miller Holdings' temporary holding account. The cost of this second, desperate loan was even higher than Victor's, but it was packaged as a high-value asset loan, which sounded less like panic and more like portfolio management. At 9:30 a.m., Greg met Ethan Price at a small legal office near the diner. Jonathan didn't go. He couldn't face the contractor again. Greg delivered the $150,000 certified check and the multi-year facilities contract, complete with the devastating, reputation-destroying disclosure clause. Greg called Jonathan 30 minutes later, his voice exhausted. "It's done, Jonathan." Price signed the contract and took the money. He shook my hand and said, "We have a great working relationship now. He's completely neutralized. He's invested in our success now." Jonathan felt a momentary rush of relief, but it was quickly replaced by profound emptiness. He had stopped the leak, but he had lost a major part of the ship. "And the Victor repayment?" Jonathan asked, his voice rough. "I am wiring the $70,000 now. The principal plus the 40% interest. That account will be empty again, Jonathan. We are operating on zero reserves. We are entirely dependent on whatever short-term cash flow we can generate this week." Jonathan hung up. The immediate crisis was over. He had paid the extortion, silenced the witness, and maintained his image. He was still Jonathan Miller, the successful millionaire. But internally, he was a hollow shell, held together only by high-interest debt and the threat of public ruin. He spent the rest of the week maintaining the performance. He took meetings, he laughed easily, he talked about exciting new acquisitions that didn't exist, and he made sure to be seen lunching at the most exclusive club in town. He was playing the part so intensely that he almost convinced himself everything was fine. But the physical toll was visible. He was sleeping 3 hours a night, waking up in a sweat, staring at the ceiling of his gilded bedroom. Carol noticed the change, of course, but she interpreted it as the stress of a man managing vast fortunes. "You're working too hard, darling," she said one evening, rubbing his tense shoulders. "You need a break. Maybe we should plan that ski trip to Aspen for Christmas. We haven't been since last year." Jonathan flinched, pulling away slightly. The Aspen condo, the collateral for Victor's loan, was now technically out of their hands. If he missed the repayment, Victor would seize it instantly. "Aspen is out, Carol," Jonathan said, his voice curt. "We're leasing it out this year. Need the revenue stream. We'll go somewhere else, maybe the Caribbean." He watched the disappointment flash across Carol's face, but she quickly masked it. "Oh, well, if it's necessary for the portfolio, dear, of course."
Jonathan needed this appearance. He needed to show that the embarrassment of the previous week was indeed a minor glitch, long forgotten. As they walked across the lawn, Jonathan kept his arm around Sophie's shoulder, projecting a relaxed paternal image. Sophie, however, felt heavy and distant under his touch. They ran into Laura Chen almost immediately. Laura was standing near the gourmet coffee stand, chatting with another mother. She smiled widely at Jonathan, a polished, social smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
"Jonathan, Sophie, lovely to see you," Laura chirped. "I heard the most wonderful news, Jonathan. Headmaster Henderson was telling me that Miller Holdings finalized a massive new maintenance contract this week. Sounds like you're expanding the portfolio significantly." Jonathan's heart lurched. Laura Chen wasn't just gossiping, she was testing him. She had clearly heard some rumors, likely from the school staff who processed Ethan Price's paperwork, and was confirming his stability. "It's very exciting, Laura," Jonathan replied smoothly, giving a confident nod. "A major expansion into the Stanford market. Had to move some capital around last week, which caused a tiny headache with my platinum card. You know how those banks are. But everything is running perfectly now. Just another day at the office." Laura smiled, softened, turning into respect. She bought the narrative. Jonathan had successfully re-established the illusion. "Well, congratulations, Jonathan. Always ahead of the curve," she said, her voice laced with the old envy and admiration he craved. Relief washed over him. He had won the social battle. But then he saw Ethan Price.
Ethan was standing near the facilities tent, talking to a maintenance worker about the setup of the electrical cables for the food trucks. He was wearing a Miller Holdings jacket, a high-quality embroidered navy blue jacket that Jonathan's company provided to all its high-level contractors. It was a symbol of their new exclusive partnership. Ethan caught Jonathan's eye. He didn't smile, he didn't nod. He simply raised his coffee cup slightly, in a gesture that was neither friendly nor hostile, but purely transactional. It was the look of a man who had successfully leveraged his position and was now reaping the rewards. Jonathan felt a cold chill. Ethan Price was no longer a threat. He was a silent partner in Jonathan's ruin. He was a constant, living reminder of the desperation that now governed Jonathan's life. Every time Jonathan saw that jacket, he would remember the Honus Wagner card and the crushing debt. "Dad?" Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. "Yes, sweetie. I'm going to go find Chloe by the dunk tank. I'll be back in an hour." "All right, Soph, have fun." As she walked away, Jonathan watched her go. She was moving with the same casual confidence as before, but the gap between them felt wider than ever. He knew he had successfully protected her world, the world of Northwood Academy, the world of private jets and expensive clothes. But he had fundamentally changed his relationship with her. He walked over to a quiet bench beneath an oak tree and sat down heavily. He pulled out his phone, not to check email, but to look at the calendar. Repayment to the art loan broker was due in 10 days. Repayment to Victor for the initial loan was due in 2 days. He had managed to scrap together the funds for Victor, but only by further leveraging a different, smaller property. He was a man drowning, selling his own lungs to buy air.
He was still wearing the expensive suit, the custom shoes, and the gold watch. He looked like the picture of success. But he had traded his integrity, his peace of mind, and his most cherished possessions for the right to maintain this image. He realized the true, devastating cost of the declined card wasn't the embarrassment at the gala or the financial loss of the high-interest loans. The cost was the loss of his moral anchor. He had been so terrified of appearing weak that he had become fundamentally, structurally weak. He was a prisoner of his own success. The turning point didn't come with a bang, but with a quiet realization several weeks later. Jonathan had managed to make all the necessary payments, dodging financial bullets with frantic, stressful maneuvers. The Honus Wagner card was temporarily safe, but every expense was scrutinized, every purchase calculated. The life of effortless luxury was gone, replaced by calculated survival. Carol, sensing the continued tension, insisted on a simple, quiet family dinner at home. No guests, no business talk. They sat in the grand, formal dining room. The crystal chandelier cast a warm, familiar glow. Jonathan was carving a roast, trying to project normalcy. "Dad, I have some news," Sophie said, putting down her fork. Oh? Good news, I hope, Jonathan asked, forcing a smile. It is. I got accepted into the early entry program for Columbia University's summer journalism course. It's an amazing opportunity. It costs $8,000 plus travel, but it looks incredible on a college application. Carol beamed. That's wonderful, sweetie. See, Jonathan, I told you she was brilliant. Jonathan's hands went cold. $8,000. Liquid, immediately available cash. It was a sum he could technically produce, but it would require another stressful scramble, another asset leverage, another call to a shady contact. He simply couldn't afford another unexpected drain.
He looked at Sophie's eager, hopeful face. She was looking at him, waiting for the easy, automatic approval that had always defined his role as her provider. He remembered the moment at the gala, the brief, unsettling confusion on her face when the credit card declined. He remembered her quiet confrontation over the Honus Wagner card. She had trusted his explanations then, but she was watching him now. He realized that if he agreed instantly, he would have to go back to the desperate, frantic performance, the secret calls, the late nights, the lying to Carol. He would be forced to sell another piece of his soul just to maintain the illusion of seamless provision. If he hesitated, or if he said no, the entire house of cards, the minor glitch, the security transfer, would collapse. Sophie would know definitively that he was lying and that their supposed permanent security was fake. He sat there, the carving knife still in his hand, trapped between two impossible choices. This is the climax. Before I reveal what Jonathan does next, make sure you've hit that like button. This ending is going to leave you speechless. He took a slow, deep breath, finally letting go of the need to control the outcome. He was exhausted by the performance. That is fantastic news, Soph, Jonathan said, his voice surprisingly calm. He looked at Carol, who was still smiling. But we need to talk about the cost. Carol's smile faltered. Jonathan, it's $8,000. It's a college preparatory course. We can afford it. In the past, yes. Right now, no, Carol, we can't, Jonathan said, the words heavy and final. He looked only at Sophie. Sophie, I am so proud of you, but I have to be honest with you both. The situation is not just turbulence. The business is in serious trouble. He took another breath, the relief of speaking the truth, even this partial truth, washing over him.
The credit card decline at the gala wasn't a security glitch. It was a real indication that our accounts were empty. I have been liquidating assets and borrowing heavily just to cover immediate business debts, trying to keep Miller Holdings afloat and save our home. I sold the Wagner card, and I've had to put the Aspen condo up as collateral to keep a major vendor quiet. Carol gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jonathan, why didn't you tell me? Aspen? The condo? Because I was terrified of losing your respect, Carol, and yours, Soph. I thought if I admitted failure, I would lose everything that mattered. Sophie was staring at him, not with anger, but with a quiet, profound sadness that cut deeper than any rage. She finally had the answer to the question she had been asking for months. The truth wasn't glorious or easy. It was terrifying and small. The $8,000 for the summer course, Soph, is money we simply don't have right now without creating another crisis. Jonathan continued, his voice cracking slightly. I can't keep borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. I have to stop the bleeding. I have to stop pretending. He felt the years of stress lift away as the truth spilled out. He was no longer the infallible provider. He was just a desperate man who had made terrible choices. I may lose the business, Carol. We may have to sell this house. I don't know what the future holds, but I promise you this. I will stop lying. We will face this together. Honestly, the silence in the grand dining room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the expensive HVAC system, the kind of system Ethan Price now managed. Carol slowly began to cry, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. Sophie didn't cry. She just looked at her father, studying him in a way she never had before, seeing the man, not the myth. So, no Columbia this summer? She asked softly.
I am so sorry, Soph. Not this summer. Jonathan replied, his voice thick with genuine sorrow. Sophie nodded. She wasn't disappointed in the opportunity. She was processing the full weight of the deception. "Okay, Dad," she said finally. "Thank you for telling the truth." That simple statement, "Thank you for telling the truth," was the most devastating indictment and the most profound relief Jonathan had ever experienced. He had lost his financial standing, but in that moment, he had taken the first painful step toward regaining the only thing that truly mattered, his daughter's trust. He had been so focused on maintaining the image of success for the outside world that he had nearly destroyed his family's reality. The declined card had been a necessary, humiliating trigger. Jonathan Miller, the man who had insisted everything was fine, finally stood ruined in his own expensive home, stripped of his lies, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of genuine hope. The performance was over. The hard work of rebuilding a life based on reality, not illusion, had just begun. What did you think of Jonathan's story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, subscribe and hit that bell icon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.